Hey everyone, welcome back to the Sports Psych Show. Thanks so much for joining me. Today, I'm going to be speaking with Jon Mackey. Jon, welcome.
Thank you, Dan. It's a great pleasure to be here. Lovely to see you.
It's great to be speaking with you. We're going to be talking about psychology of combat sport, coaching in combat sport. We might even be touching on, I suppose, the psychology of the role of the sporting director. But let's start where we always start. Tell us a little bit about yourself and tell us about your work.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. And again, thanks for the invitation. It's great. It's great to be here, and it's an honour. So, my name is Jon Mackey. As you said, I'm based here in Dublin, in Ireland. I work professionally within the sport of canoeing, within the national governing body there. I'm the performance director, so I manage the Olympic programme across two Olympic sports, which is canoe slalom and canoe sprint. We're in a very busy period at the moment because the Paris Games, the Olympic Games, are 6 months away now, so we're prepping for that, and we've started our camps in Paris, which is really exciting. We've qualified 3 boats, which is the first time in Irish canoe slalom history to do that. So that's a very proud one to be part of the team that's done that.
Yeah.
In my spare time when I have it, the sport I come from and the sport I grew up in was taekwondo and kickboxing. So I'm very much embedded within the combat sport environment at the amateur end of the spectrum here in Ireland. So I started my own training in 1986. I started coaching. I'll use the term loosely, coaching in 2004. I thought I was coaching. I think looking back on it now, it was anything but. But thankfully, I think I've progressed since then. I started working with the national team, the national kickboxing team, in 2013. I was appointed assistant national coach, and I worked with the national coach up until 2015. And then I was appointed national coach for the light contact discipline in kickboxing. And for the last 3 years, I've been working with the full contact and the ring sports disciplines as national coach. And we had a really successful year last year. So kickboxing is on the Olympic program. We're recognized by the IOC. And we're not participants in the summer games yet, and we're hopeful that will happen in time to come. But we do have access to other competitions that are under the IOC patronage, and we were at the European Olympic Games last year, so that was our first outing on a stage as big as that. And I'm very proud to say I worked with the athlete that came home with the only gold medal for the Irish team. We won a number of silvers and some bronzes, but the athlete that I'm working directly with, Amy Wall, was the first Irish athlete to win a gold medal with the coveted Olympic rings on it. So that's a really proud moment for me, and something nice to have on the CV. So that's a little snapshot of where I've come from, who I am, and where I'm working, where my passion sits.
And I believe you're currently doing a professional doctorate as well?
I am indeed. I'm with the Prof Doc program in Dublin City University. I'm middle of year 2 now at the moment. So the nose is just about above water. Sinks every now and again, but it's a fantastic program. Lots of support from the team there. It's the type of program that's designed to work around your professional kind of your career and that. So very amenable to to kind of shift your timetable around to suit what's needed from a professional capacity. So very much enjoying that, Dan.
I was going to ask you actually just briefly some details there, because I know so many coaches listening in would be interested in this. What does that actually consist of? Where does that, a PhD, you're asking a research question and spending 4 years leading towards that question. But professional doctorate, in your case, is there a research question, or is it just a series of learning modules?
Yeah, so the first year is built around learning modules, but the overall perspective of the doctorate is for professional practice. So you're a doctor of professional practice, and you kind of spend your first year investigating some questions within your own profession to see if you can develop some research to answer some of those questions and to solve real world problems, as opposed to, like you referenced there, PhD, what might be investigating theoretical concepts and things like that. So it's very much hands-on. It's very much about how you can actually apply the research to your professional practice in order to fix or to come to a solution for some of the problems that we might be experiencing.
May I be slightly nosy and ask what kind of questions you've posed in the first year?
Lots of questions. So we looked at, and we're very lucky to have the team that's there within the program. So Dr. Anya McNamara, Jamie Taylor, Mike Ashford as guest lecturers. A couple of questions I had were originally around talent development.
Okay.
and how young people progress in sport. And that, just through probing and prodding and suggesting and conversations, we kind of went down the skill acquisition route.
Okay.
So not just talent development, but how we're actually acquiring or developing skill as part of that. And where I'm at now at the moment is actually just uh, researching around the role of active inference and predictive processing, etc., as to how we make decisions based on the principles of active inference or free energy principle. So
Well, I'd certainly love to potentially broaden that conversation on that side of things. And as a sports psychologist, I take a very broad definition. I say this loads of times, Jon, on the Sports Psych Show. I have a very broad definition of sports psychology, in as much as I think as psychologists we can be and should be interested in areas of coaching science and skill acquisition. Even into various sports sciences. So I think that kind of conversation is absolutely crucial. Do these questions that you're posing stem from your experiences throughout your coaching career? And obviously we're talking combat sports here more than anything else, but just reflecting on something you mentioned earlier, you in a bit of self-effacing appraisal, you said that when you started coaching, you suggested that you weren't really coaching. I think it was around about back in 2004. Do these questions that are emerging in your professional doctorate and have probably come about in the last few years of coaching combat sports as a consequence of your original experiences as a coach a couple of decades ago?
yeah, well, that's a great question. Very well picked up on, and my answer is absolutely yes. So Um, when I talk about what I did in 2004 for a couple of years, which I thought was coaching at the time, when I look back on it now, it wasn't coaching at all. And sometimes when I meet some of the kids that I was working with at the time, they're all grown up now, and I kind of half jokingly, half serious, kind of apologize for their experiences with me at the time. But to answer your question, I came from a very prescriptive traditional martial art where we all lined up in order of rank. Taekwondo comes from the Korean military. There was a person at the top, more times than often, a man, a senior rank, who told us what to do, instructed us what to do over and over and over. There was very little room for expression of movement or for free thought. You just followed the orders. And I guess I was somewhat influenced by that when I started my own kind of coaching journey. I opened a club in Cabra here in Dublin City, and that was how I applied myself, thinking that everybody in front of me was just an empty vessel, and my job was to fill them up with the vast amounts of knowledge that I had. But after a number of years, and especially when I started to get involved with the sports side of things within combat sports, you've got kind of traditional martial arts, and then you've got the sport aspect of it. And I I was very much interested in that side of things, and I could see a dichotomy emerging between one style of instruction, to use that word, versus what was happening in real world performances, and it was very different. And I remember kind of at a period, maybe 3 or 4 years into that journey, wondering why some people that would look really good on the pads or hitting the bag, really good, weren't having the same, or they weren't transferring directly into the performance. So that style, that elegance on the bag or hitting the pads, didn't come out within in real time performance. And that was the first point in my development where I thought there's something going on here. What is it? And I remember drawing a pyramid that I was trying to brain dump and an idea of where my head was going. I remember drawing a pyramid in terms of what's the most important aspect that I could be giving these athletes or these students. And it wasn't the fact that they had to have the perfect technique, or their technique should look a certain way. It was the fact that they needed to understand how to move efficiently and creatively on the mats or in the ring. And this is the thing that I thought was missing from these other guys that looked really well in static environments, but just couldn't transfer that into the performance environment, or what we might call ring craft. And so the ability to move dynamically, not just think about kind of forwards and backwards movement. And as part of that pyramid, and I hung it up on our dojang wall, the bottom of it was movement. The next up from that was tactics. So for me now, I started to think movement and tactics were something that were really, really important, more important than technique. So technique was further up that chain of hierarchy, if you like. So the platform for good performances was good movement, and then having that good movement to underpin good tactics. Technique would follow later. It wasn't even that important. And that set me off on a journey that I guess maybe 3 or 4 years later, through a number of different kind of coach development courses, the most influential one, interestingly enough, was actually through canoe sport, where there was an instructor developer that I worked with who was a really, really interesting guy called John Pierce, who started to talk about problematizing, so solving problems or having the participants or the athletes solve problems as opposed to giving them the answers all the time. So that nudged me on. He suggested reading Galway's Inner Skiing. That went on then from there to bounce, went into the nurture nature kind of debates, then on the talent code, and then onto the sports gene, and then fell into this concept of ecological dynamics, which I kind of hit a bit of a dead end with. And I remember being suggested at the time to get onto Twitter, as it was at the time, and start following a couple of people to get an understanding of ecological dynamics and everything that went with that. And it was mind blowing at the time. I thought, wow, look at this. This is something that I think kind of answers my call as a coach for where I'm going. But my experiences of engaging with the conversations around people involved in or who would kind of maybe promote an ecological dynamics approach, it was really it was absolutist, and it didn't allow me the freedom to continue to explore. So it was like, okay, this is everything got to do with ecological dynamics, and everything else was wrong. And the bit within that conversation was around the use of drills. So I thought, okay, I like this ecological dynamics approach, but all of a sudden now I'm being told not to do drills. And I'm like, well, hang on a minute. Drills are a fundamental part of combat sport training for lots of reasons. Not just, it's not just about trying to develop the perfect isolated technique. We have to come away from the actual performance, because it's a dangerous environment. People getting kicked in the face, punched in the nose, what have you, kicked in the ribs. We don't want new people coming into the sport to experience that have that experience and have a negative experience. So drills are a fundamental part of what we do, and I couldn't get my head around, why am I being told to stop doing these drills? And eventually I found that the term drill has a lot of different definitions based on what sport you come from. And combat sport coaches around me here in Ireland were on a similar journey, and I'm reading their stuff on social media, and it was kill the drills. Drills don't equal skills. And I'm like, oh, there's something, I'm missing something here. But in conversation, it became very apparent that drills on a football pitch or on a hockey pitch or on a GAA pitch are very, very different to drills within a combat sport environment. I had to go and do my own little bit of research around that and have a look at what hockey are doing and what football are doing in terms of what do they mean by drills. And now I appreciate that. For us, drills in combat sport include taking slices of the performance out and working through certain scenarios in a semi-live, semi-compliant fashion. Some may say you're applying constraints to the, constraints kind of led approach to that, exploring, options. So, for example, putting somebody in the corner of the ring and having them work out of that. Nobody wants to be stuck in the corner or against the ropes, where you can be scored on, you can be picked off, you can be hurt, knocked down, knocked out, etc. So we've got lots of different solutions, to use that term, to get out of the corner and get off the ropes. And we might actually take that section or that slice of the performance and work through it. But in combat sport, that's a drill. So now, so I was getting this kind of pushback against drills, and I have to, I guess, explore a little bit myself about what is actually being said and what is actually being meant. And that, like, where I'm at now is that there's a lot of incongruency across language within different coaching environments. And one thing might not necessarily mean the same thing in two different sports. And I think sometimes as coaches, we can fall down that hole and just take things as gospel, and just start applying that then to our own practice. So again, I guess it's a little bit about maintaining that kind of critical eye. And that was the bit, after a bit of a ramble, Dan, that was the bit that kind of propelled me into the question as to where I am now with my professional doctorate, was to investigate a little bit more. For me, ecological dynamics and ecological psychology is a fascinating theory of direct perception. It's a theory, but for me, there's a lot more going on. we're complex systems as human beings, and I think the best things we can be as coaches is consistently curious and just to keep pushing our boundary to say what else is going on, what more can I learn, and what is this person saying, what is that person saying, what does that theory say, what does this theory say. And I think as coaches then we can just become better practitioners and understanding the people that we're actually trying to help get better. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it was a very rich description of your history as a coach, and what I heard you say was that as an athlete yourself, as a warrior yourself, a combatant yourself, you were perhaps exposed to quite a lot of what you might call prescriptive coaching. You were told what to do, how to do it, and then you simply did that. What I'm hearing you say is, as you started your coaching journey, you started to acknowledge the importance of situation specific coaching. So you mentioned a contemporary of yours, John Pierce, and he talked about problematizing situations, so giving athletes problems and helping them find solutions. And what was it became important to you was being less prescriptive and much more contextual in your coaching, much more trying to coach through activities that do resemble the challenges that they face. And in combat sports, that is where drills lie, essentially, is what I'm hearing you. And because you're quite you're a very curious coach,
Yes.
this led you on a journey to reading lots of books, and then starting to read lots of papers, and you came across this term ecological dynamics. And there are clearly podcasts that are dedicated solely to the idea of ecological dynamics. This podcast isn't, and there would definitely be coaches listening in who, when you said that, would have gone, ecological what? So when you said that, what do you mean by ecological dynamics, and how might that lie differently to your experiences as an athlete and your early experiences as a coach?
Well, I guess my initial understanding around ecological dynamics, and I guess this might be the catalyst for, where I went with this, and then kind of diverged a little bit. So originally, ecological dynamics to me meant just more specificity of practice, more practice fidelity, less telling, more encouraging. And then I got to a point, and again through kind of conversations with other coaches who would adopt an ecological dynamics approach, would this concept of instruction being a bad thing, and that was another kind of I don't fully agree with that. And then having teased that out, and in fact, you don't have to go back too far in some of them online discussions to see that it has been suggested by some who I think don't fully understand the ecological dynamics theory and approach. They might say that instruction kills creativity. And after some debate, that became, well, a little bit of instruction might be okay. And then that went to, well, actually, instructions are fine because within ecological dynamics theory, they're a constraint and they can be applied as information to shape behavior. So I was trying to make sense of all of this that was going on. But for me, at that time, ecological dynamics just meant less prescription, less reading off the hymn sheet, more problematizing, more allowing the athletes to explore for solutions. And for me, that wasn't just about standing back. And I know the ecological dynamics approach would be very much about, coaches becoming designers, practice or environmental designers to allow this kind of exploration and discovery happen. For me, I was very much hands-on with the team I was working with. I would like to ask questions. I would like to make suggestions, all within an instructional framework, for example. I would also like to get the opinion of other athletes. So you've got that kind of social kind of learning thing going on as well. And sometimes when you stand back and let the coaches or the athletes actually coach themselves, you see a lot more dynamic happening, a lot of different information coming out as well. But you're facilitating that through a number of different theories that are happening at the same time, which I think is the magical part of it. But so for me, Dan, I guess to try and answer your question, that's where I was going with my understanding of ecological dynamics, and the dichotomized debates that I ended up kind of being in around information processing theory versus ecological dynamics kind of pushed me even more to try and investigate exactly what was going on in the middle of all of that.
It's really interesting reflecting on some of the things you've said there. It sounds like you're taking quite an eclectic approach to coaching in terms of, you spoke there about being very hands-on with your athletes, asking questions, making suggestions, engaging your athletes in self-coaching, bringing other coaches in, observation, and so on and so forth. It reminded me, Jon, of the episode I did with Dr. Brendan Susi and Dr. Shane Pill, and the spectrum of coaching styles, almost as if they talk about coaching being a series of episodes, and it almost sounds quite episodic there, depending on what is required in the moment. So that's the first thing, and there's no question there. It would be interesting to get your reflection on coaching as a series of episodes, but also what it was making me think of is that as a curious coach, you're borrowing and lending from different theories. Ultimately, no matter what theory it is, at the heart of all of this is you're just passionate about helping your people learn.
Yes.
Your competitors learn. And you strip all this away, learning lies at the heart of all of this. So, coaching as episodic or series of episodes, and learning at front and center of in our activities. As I say, no question, just a thought there.
Yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree. And that was a great episode that you had the guys on talking about the Moston Ashworth, the spectrum of coaching styles and knowing when and where to apply them at a given time. And again, Dan, I think that changes depending on the population that you're working with. So I may not apply similar methods to a group of people who are relatively new to the sport for obvious reasons. They will need a whole pile more hands-on scaffolding, helping their understanding, reducing contextual interference, to use that term, and just developing a safe environment for them to actually start to understand what the sport is about. Because if you take it from a very simple kind of example, you could get a 26-year-old person come in off the street who has no concept of combat sport whatsoever. So you have to engage with them at their level of understanding and just help them build their own understanding of what the sport is, techniques that make up the sport, the movement that underpins the sport, and bring them along that journey in their own time. And sometimes that's a group of people, which is really great, because then you've got that interaction, that human interaction between people, which I think is really wonderful for learning. And just bouncing off people, different ideas, different suggestions. So it is very much about, it's context dependent. And some people might even call me a pragmatist if it doesn't get me too beat up. And yeah, it really does depend. And I know that might be thrown out as a cop out. But it does depend on the people that you're working with, the person that you're working with, where they're at, their past experiences, how they're feeling that day, the weekend they've had. All that amounts to your interaction with them during that session. And that's really important. And you can look at, you can wrap yourself up in a theory of skill acquisition. And if you do that and miss all of the other rich theories that are built around trying to understand who we are and how we engage with the world around us and people around us, well then you're already off to a bad start. So there's so much more going on, and I think that's the piece of coaching that I love to investigate the most, because of our kind of our complexities. We're not empty vessels.
There's a great deal of individual specificity, isn't there, between us? And what you've been saying there makes me reflect back on my own coaching days, coaching golf. And it makes me think, when I used to coach at the driving range, and the thing with golf coaching is you could coach sort of 40 hours a week. So you're getting a lot of different individuals coming through, a lot of different age groups, levels. I think I didn't coach for years and years. I coached for half a dozen years before I set off on my journey as a sports psychologist. But I definitely got to a position as I matured as a coach. I definitely realized, and you use that term, engage. I used to engage people at the beginning of a session, just to, especially a first session, just to try to establish the model I wanted to use, because there was definitely, when I reflect back, definitely some players who came along who I could, if they were new, I would get the feeling, this is a person I can say to them, show me what a golf swing looks like. and they'd be very comfortable at replaying what they've seen historically in the past, and they just do it. Whereas others, who I just got the impression that I would be better served, actually taking them step by step through a grip, a stance, a posture, an initial part of the swing, and through the ball. There is definitely, and I'm not saying I got it right every single time. I'm not going to sugarcoat it, but you're looking for ways as you become more experienced. You're looking for clues and cues with regard how you're going to go about coaching them. But there's not, for me, there's just not one way. Everything's interesting, but what is optimal is usually what the individual presents.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, and really agree with that. And you'll see that a lot, I think, with coaching beginners into the sport, that you might have to adopt your style or your approach, given on each, with each person in the group as opposed to the group itself. You might even rely on internal focus of attention for certain things, just to get them used to certain ways of standing or moving, even though the research says that external focus is a better way to is a better focus, but maybe not always.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably understanding that there are other tools there that you can use in your coaching toolkit that you might have to lean on in order to get a good result for this particular person, as opposed to saying, well, I don't necessarily agree with that theory, so I'm not going to employ something attached to it or a method that's influenced by it.
Question I have for you as I was listening into what you've been saying is remaining with this idea of learning. When do you feel that your athletes have learned? What little cues are you looking for? What are you looking for changes in behaviours? I'm just fascinated by that area. When we've talked a lot before on the Sports Light show about the difference between learning and performance, especially with Professor Mark Williams and Professor Nikki Hodges. Yeah, when you think about learning, are you looking to differentiate it from performance? What little cues and clues are you looking at for evidence of learning?
That's a great question. That's a super question. And I think I can reflect back on our journey towards the European Olympic Games, and when I was working with a couple of athletes there. Um, what we will do in our preparation is, my philosophy is about building contextual priors and as much understanding about our opponents as possible, and based on how our opponents move. So we study them hard, and we can generally pinpoint some unconscious movement patterns that we can exploit. And some of those movement patterns may not be obvious to the athlete. And I think this is maybe the coach's eye coming out, from my perspective anyway. And between myself and the athlete, we develop an understanding of these unconscious movement patterns, and then develop an understanding as to how we can exploit these as part of the performance. So we bring that into our training, and at the start it can be a little bit frustrating if the athlete's maybe not used to it. And the example I'm trying to give is that, with Amy, who won the gold, we had an opponent who had a very good front leg, her lead leg psychic. She would gauge all the distance with this big, long, very adaptive, skillful lead leg. And in the ring, it's not often seen. That type of tactic is not often seen. It's usually kind of the range is controlled by the hands and the upper body, which Amy would be really good at. So we had to investigate how to get past this front leg, and that was really difficult for her at the start. But when we started to get around, so across the threshold of understanding, and when learning started to embed itself, she would start, first of all, from an isolated perspective on the pads, start to feel what it felt like to get the timing right and to hit the pad with enough bang to say, yeah, that felt good. And she would acknowledge that. We had a scale of 1 to 10, and I asked her, out of 10, how did that feel to you? And if it was a 7 or a 6, she knew she could maybe get the timing better, get the impact a little harder. But when it was good, we both knew it was good, and she would acknowledge that. Then we had to take it into an environment that was less compliant. And so she's in against somebody who is maybe not moving at 100%, but they're giving her the leg to read off and to understand those kinematic cues as to when the leg was going to come and get the timing right. So without me saying anything, just observing, she would start to do this and find the timing and the range herself. And she would acknowledge that, and she would look at me and she would let me know that she was happy with that. And we would start to just become less compliant and less compliant until it's showing itself, it's presenting itself more often in full performances than it isn't. And when she'd come back, when the round finishes and she'd come back to the corner, we would debrief. How did that feel? What did it feel like? What were you thinking when you shot the hand out and you pulled the leg down? And she would be able to verbalize how that felt and what it meant to her, and the feedback, the internal feedback that she got from that, and it made her feel good. So for me, when she said that felt really good, for me that was like, okay, this is settling in, this is setting in now, and this is starting to become part of her behavior. So she has learned this through that process.
A few things I've written down there. Contextual priors. Just before I go on, contextual prior. What do you mean by contextual prior?
So, and this is where active inference became really interesting to me. Was about how we deal with uncertainty. And I've gone through a career of coaching now, working with other coaches who their only experience of the opponent when they step into the ring with their athlete is what happens after the bell rings. And the athlete is unsure, uncertain, has no plan. The plan will be made as the match unfolds. And maybe they're on the back foot, and maybe it's too late now to have a plan. So, my approach is to build those contextual priors by studying the opponent, by having some understanding of what they're going to do when the bell goes. And I made reference to these unconscious movement patterns then. And regardless of what level these guys are competing at, every single one of them, and they might be culturally influenced depending on what country they come from, have unconscious movement patterns. And what I mean by that is, and I'm getting right down into their bounce rate, so how they're moving on their knees, whether their weight distribution is forward and backwards, whether they give some sort of tell before they kick or before they punch, and they all do. Every single one of them have a tell. And if you can identify that tell, and if you can build an understanding in your athlete about there is your time to go, there's your time to attack. And when you do it at that point, there is nothing they can do for a good couple of seconds because they're engaged in this inefficient, unconscious movement behavior. Does that make sense? So we're building up this understanding and having a toolkit of solutions ready for us to go. We've already won in our heads. We've already taken this athlete apart because we've studied them. They know what they're going to do within the first 30 seconds. If she's going to kick, she's going to do this first. It might be a twitch of the arm, it might be a drop of the shoulder, it might be a bounce forward, a bounce back. They're trying to get comfortable in the range that they want to operate at. So giving the athlete all of this contextual prior information is a really, really valuable way of building their confidence and removing that uncertainty. So they've got a plan right from the start, as opposed to let's see what happens in the first round and we'll have a plan on the break. Sometimes that's too late.
I have this wonderful clip that I show clients, and it's a moment in the corner, a conversation between Tyson Fury and Ben Davison, his former trainer. Primarily just Ben Davison talking at Tyson Fury, and it's from the first Fury Wilder fight. And it's one of my favorite coaching moments because Ben Davison points out, I think he says something like, I'm going to butcher this, but he says something along the lines of, you notice when Wilder rocks onto his heels or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
That's his mental break in concentration. That's your opportunity to throw the right. Again,
Yes.
I can't remember if it was throw to right, but it was something like that.
Yes.
And it's, I don't know if they had utilized that piece of information as a contextual prior, exactly like you're saying there.
Mm-hmm.
But I just thought that was wonderful how actually psychological skills, concentration, confidence, commitment, control, all these things are actually embodied and can be seen within movement.
Yes.
And you were talking about unconscious movements as a consequence of their style of fighting, for example, but
Yes.
potentially unconscious movements as a consequence of where they are mentally.
Yes.
And I just thought that was wonderful, wonderful coaching.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that's a case in point, Dan. And I think from my own journey, when I spoke about kind of becoming more interested in how people move as opposed to the techniques they're throwing. This was kind of I guess the my first understanding of why movement was so important. So now it's not only important to create efficient movers in the ring, but understanding movement now allows us to strip down our opponent, okay, and find out exactly where these points within the movement we can exploit. Like for example, if you've got and the Hungarians won't mind me saying this, but the Hungarians have a style that they go from front foot to back foot, front foot to back foot in their bounce. If you catch them on the front foot, there is absolutely nothing they can do to counter what you've done with their attack. And 9 times out of 10, if your timing is right, they'll fall down and they won't know why. Well, they'll know why now if they listen to your podcast. But um, it's just a very simple example of understanding movement patterns and how to exploit them. Another one is stepping up to the side kick. So the back kick will step to the front foot, and then the front foot reaches and kicks out. If you catch them as the back foot is stepping, you're catching them, and that's a very inefficient movement pattern. You've caught them, and there's nothing they can do while their feet are together. No reply. Now, they're very obvious examples. There are much finer cues that you can pick up on, right down to the nod of a head. Not right, seriously, like the head nods. It's not. It's like the opponent is giving themselves confirmation that they're about to do something, and it's just ingrained. It's just a psychological thing that comes out. They just give themselves a little nod or a shrug of the shoulders, and then the attack. Catch them on the nod. When I was a younger coach, I used to say it's like jamming a fork into their toaster. It just interrupts that thought process. And the more, to go back to your point about contextual priors, the more you can arm the athlete with that kind of information, the more it strips it down for them and becomes less uncertain about what's going to happen and gives them more control, psychologically more control in the ring. And it's a really great method for building confidence. Conor McGregor is another great example. If you're way back to when he beat Jose Aldo, they had a plan. They had a shared mental model going into that fight, him and his team, about hassling Aldo, annoying him so much in the press conferences, insulting him so much in the press conferences to entice him and anger him to run at Conor McGregor. And the answer they had for that was a check left hook, so catching him over the top with the left hook as he came forward. And there's video clips on YouTube showing Conor McGregor practicing this in an isolated fashion. He's visualizing it. He might be cognitively priming this movement. And he's going through it. And within 13 seconds, within the first round, against one of the best mixed martial artists of his time, in 13 seconds, he's knocked out Jose Aldo. He didn't go into the first round with a view that let's see what happens. He's built up so much information on this guy, so much contextual priors, that he was able to just execute that flawlessly. And it's rare you see that, to be honest with you. It's rare you see that. But it's a great example.
And it's really interesting because it's so relevant to an episode we've recently released from David Horrocks, who worked at Manchester United and did a single case study into the perceptual cognitive qualities, the deliberate practice processes of Gary Neville, and what potentially separated him: his decision making, his match game day preparation, his commitment to deliberate practice, and everything you're speaking about. From a combat sport perspective, Gary Neville actually engaged with the cognitive priming. I mean, he would go to teammates and he would talk to them about how they could work together to reduce the threat of certain players who are playing on the wing that might be a threat to Gary Neville. So there's the shared mental model and shared solution finding as well. And then the cognitive priming was that Dave said to me that when he interviewed Gary Neville, Gary would say, he was constantly thinking about these specific things. So I suppose that's the contextual prize as well. And he would set up activities for himself to deal with that. Now,
Yeah.
just again, I'm so interested in your coaching process around learning here, just to reflect on something you said. So you've set up these contextual prize, and given the nature of your sport, so often it's based on these subconscious movement biases that you're going to exploit. So you've got a shared mental model with your athlete that you're creating, those contextual priors, and then you're getting them. Please correct me if I misheard you. You're, in essence, and again, we're going to come to language here, language of your sport, you're engaging them in a what could be considered a drill in combat sports perspective. What you're doing is you're setting up an activity where they're practicing the movement, the kick, if you like, or the punch that's going to exploit those subconscious movement patterns. Am I correct? Did I hear you correctly there? You're stripping it back, and that's what they're doing.
Absolutely. Yep. And depending, we might not have to strip it back too much, but for this particular set of tactics and strategies, we had to strip it right back because it was something that she was not used to. It was the girl that we were prepping for was an outlier in full contact kickboxing, where, like boxing, a lot of the range finding, a lot of the sussing out is done from the front hand. This girl had an extraordinary front leg, and she could probably write her name on the blackboard with her foot. It was that, like, the dexterity she had in her front leg was incredible, and it was fast, and her timing was good, and it was aggressive, and she could hassle. So this was something that was really, really new, and she was unbeaten. The girl was absolutely unbeaten. She's only been beaten once in the last couple of years. So we had to, because this was such a new movement pattern, we had to strip it right back, just low contextual interference, right down, so we could just isolate it and just get an understanding of what it felt like to throw. And it was what we would colloquially call a spear jab, which is a jab thrown from a longer range with a different mechanics behind it, but it's really effective for closing down the front leg before it comes into action. So it was something she had never done before. So we had to strip it right back to get the mechanics of that, the kinematic chaining of that right from the front foot as opposed to the back foot, and just develop our understanding and then build it up, just reduce the compliancy. So a drill, for example, in that context would be, one, working with me on the pad, two, working with somebody in a slightly compliant fashion. They're not telegraphing, but they're not kicking explosively either. They're allowing Amy, the athlete, to just gauge her distance, to watch for the cues, to allow her to make mistakes, get hit by the kick, reset, go again. It's compliant. It's not full on. Right up across that spectrum of representativeness into full sparring. And everything across that spectrum we would refer to as drills, including using constraints. I mean, constraints are present all of the time, but from a constraints-led coaching approach, manipulating the task would all be called drills.
Interesting. And as you were doing that, as you were engaging your athlete in that drill, I heard you use scaling.
Yes.
Why scaling? What do you feel that, on a scale of 1 to 10, tell me about,
Mm-hmm.
or where are you now, and then tell me about, why scaling? Where did you pick that up from? Why would you use that?
I don't know where I picked it up from. I think I just came to it intuitively, and it was part of me wanting to know, get feedback from them about how they felt about it without us having to stop and have a discussion. So while I'm holding the pads, or while she's moving about, if she was to throw something, now we would already kind of have an agreement that anything under 7 probably needs a little bit more attention, maybe a little bit more intention.
Yeah.
So if it was under 7 from her perspective, and that's her telling me how she felt about it, well, then she knew she had to focus on maybe shooting a little bit sooner, going a little bit faster, rather than having to stop everything and say, well, how did that go? And, break the flow of the drill itself. So she would pop the front hand in and she would just shout out 7. And she'd move again and she'd pop it in, and you would know when it landed right, when she got the timing right, it would feel right, it would sound right from my perspective, and her body language would say that's going to be an 8 or 9. Now, we never got to a 10 because that's Amy. perfection is way up here, and she's going to strive for that. But we'd always get to a 7 or 8 or even a 9. And when we got to a 9, there was a smile, there was a high five. Yes, this is, I'm getting this now. It was just a really easy kind of method or, process of engaging her for where she's at mentally in relation to that particular tactic.
It's got to be in a game of skiing. That's got to be your source. I know.
It
I'm
probably is.
fascinated because I picked up In a Game of Golf at the age of 15. So In a Game of Tennis by Galway was the first Galway book, and then In a Game of Golf, and then I think he went on to skiing from there. And definitely In a Game of Golf was there was quite a bit of scaling in there in terms of your golf movements, and that was furthered by somebody called Alan Fine, who was quite a prominent mental skills coach in the 90s in golf, and he used borrowed a lot from Galway's book, and I think even Sir John Whitmore in the world of business coaching was using a lot of scaling. So they all sort of come from the same crowd, the same company, if you like, and yeah, I would, as a golf coach, utilize scaling from the perspective of awareness of movement, awareness of where somebody is, but also just playing with that and enabling people to have rich sensorial experiences, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does absolutely make sense. What you're asking them to do is be very aware of what they've just done, from a movement perspective, from an emotional perspective, and taking all of that in, and then very quickly reflecting on it, and then communicating that to me. And for me, that's an important part of that process, because as a coach who's on the side of the ring, my job is to facilitate the strategy, not to tell her what to do, but to facilitate the strategy. So we need to have a method of very precise, accurate communication that we both understand, whether that's a number or the nod of a head, or the shrug of the shoulders. So it's developing our understanding of each other and our methods of communication as well.
The other thing, I think the final thing around this conversation on learning that I took away from your detail with regard this athlete, knowledge is the word that came through, that you wanted her to know things, and it made me write down procedural and declarative knowledge, and I think that's interesting to me, because we live in a world so often in sports where sometimes people talk about just don't think, just do. You don't need to know how to do it or what to do, just do it. Those kind of sentiments. And also we live in a world, and you've mentioned ecological dynamics. I do know that maybe there might be some viewpoints there differentiating between knowledge in and knowledge of and knowledge about, and that really athletes just need this embodied sense of knowledge, that they don't necessarily need to be able to talk about or intellectualize, and that they just need to be able to do. And perhaps the process of coaching is just helping people to do rather than to be able to intellectualize. And it sounds to me like your process of coaching, and it's not to suggest that you don't want athletes just to be able to do, but maybe there's a little bit more demand on procedural and declarative knowledge, what to do and why to do it in that way for them.
Yes, 100%. I think for me, the context is key, and having them understand that context is key, and having their emotions, so their positive emotions attached to that context, is key. So we're not only building a physical athlete, we're building a psychological aspects of performance as well. So those positive experiences that she would have from those drills, I will try and bottle them and bring them with us. So we might talk, a little bit of retrieval practice. Remember the day we did this? Remember it felt like an 8? How did that feel at the time? Let's bring that back. It's like I'm just opening the bottle and allow her to drink what we've just, what we've done previously. So that's really, for me anyway, personally, I think it's really important that the athlete knows why, because they can bring that with them then to places that I'm not there, or she might go work with another coach or go to a different sport or just go on in life, and have an understanding that context is key. So for me, I think it's important to know why you're doing it as opposed to the what and the how.
we've talked extensively about learning there, and I always, when I speak to coaches, I think of coaching from the perspective of three P's: participation, progression, performance. For me, the participation piece is the engagement piece, and that's quite broad ranging in as much as how do I engage my athletes now? How do I help them enjoy this, be lifelong learners within this sport, through to mental health, well-being. The progression piece, which is very much what we've centered on in this podcast episode, around learning, but then the performance piece. So you've engaged your athletes from the perspective, often from contextual priors. You're trying to exploit subconscious movements. You're engaging them with a range of coaching behaviors, from explicit instruction through to athletes self-learning, through to demonstration, through to asking questions, making suggestions, that episodic form of coaching, if you like. Performance, though, I suppose a general question here, Jon, is: do you have any, as a coach, philosophies of performance, performing under pressure? Are there things that you tend to work on with athletes to be able to do this? Is there things that you've picked up from sports psychs maybe over the years that you go, yeah, this really works for us from a performance perspective? Tell me a little bit about executing in the arena.
It's a great question. Obviously it's a very different context. The relationship between myself and the athlete in the build up to the performance itself, that dynamic changes purposely. I will become more of a nudger and a reminder, and I'm just checking in. So I become a lot more hands off, but also just making sure that they're in the right frame of mind, they're in the right space, not overloading them with information of what they should be doing. For me, if that's not already done, I failed as a coach. So in the night previous, if we're still trying to work on something, or trying to get something primed for the following day, we've lost that window. So for me, the environment changes. I said the relationship changes. I become very purposefully relaxed, very chilled. I rely on humor a lot. I rely on the dynamics of the team a lot. I think it's important that athletes see me as being very, very relaxed about what's about to happen.
Okay.
My behavior influences their behavior, but I'm constantly just making sure and nudging and reminding at the same time about what's about to happen, the strategy that we're employing, checking in with them, how are they doing, etc. And then that's kind of the days in the run up. So if we're away at an international event, we'll all be training together. That'll be the approach that I'm taking, being there for them, being present, and making sure that they've got their needs catered for. And then on the day of the event, it's really about being there and just reinforcing the confidence. Maybe just having the chats, and just saying, again, through humor, do you remember the time we did this in training and it worked out really well and we had a bit of fun about that? And it's just really keeping it positive, and especially for a couple of athletes who might just need that confidence primed all of the time. So if you let them kind of just sit and kind of dwell on their own thoughts, they can get into a rabbit hole really quick. And you have to be really aware. You need to have good observational skills about who's fallen into that self-doubt rabbit hole, who needs a little bit of a hand pulling themselves back out of that. And the use of humor, or maybe an arm around the shoulder, or whatever, depending on the person that you're dealing with, they may need a hand in that regard. But overall, it's just about keeping everything nice and relaxed, staying confident, and making sure that the strategy that we have planned together, that shared mental model, hasn't lost itself to nerves and anxiety, and that remains constant right up to stepping into the ring. Standing on the ropes, pulling the ropes open as they get in. I might even make a joke about the coach on the other side, about maybe the color of their t-shirt or something, and just get a little smile. And I will always say to the athletes when they come back after round one, they have to smile before going back out. It's a rule that I have. And I mean it genuinely. And I think people are getting used to that, because initially it was like, smile, we're in combat here, there's nothing to smile about. But I think if you bring that environment, that approach, you can really help with their confidence. You can really help with their anxiety, and they feed so much off our body language and our behavior as coaches. We need to be really, really conscious of that we have a very powerful influence on them, I think, as coaches, and especially young athletes will soak that up. So it's really important that we carry ourselves in the right way. And then that's tested, I guess, that approach, that pre-performance approach, is tested when things don't go right, Dan. So I'm painting a picture here that everything is rosy in the garden and everything's going to go well. Sometimes it doesn't. And you have to know when that kind of nice, soft approach is not what's needed now for round two. And I've been very, very direct and prescriptive with some athletes who have underperformed in a round because they're overthinking something. And sometimes it's just a little, that fork in the toaster. They just need a little kind of bring back to reality, and it might be something very sharp that brings them right back to gaze, focus with you. You've got eye contact with them. They've got their breath under control. You don't start shouting at them as soon as they come back. They've got their breath under control. You have their attention, and now you get them to talk to you about what's going on. What is going on in your head right now? Why are you doing this? Tell me. Very quickly, if you've got that relationship, you can get to what I would say the problem within the performance right now, and bring them back to that shared understanding of what our strategy was going in. And that can be tricky. I mean, for me, I think that's the magic in performance coaching, is having the ability to lift a bad performance with the athlete. Not just telling them what to do, but having the athlete understand that, okay, what I've just done in that round is probably not the best tactics for this opponent. Now I need to employ what we actually just agreed we were going to employ, get them back on track. Does that make sense, Dan?
100%. I mean, there's various things I'm hearing here. I mean, it feels like the overarching plan going into a fight would be to stage the environment in many respects. It's to turn down the volume of information. Yep. Although not ignore that information, that important information completely. It's turning down the volume, lessening the amount, but not ignoring the important points completely. For you, it's really important as a coach to be able to model the kind of mindset and the kind of behaviors that you want your players to engage with. So you use the word relax a lot there. You know, you personally want to be relaxed in order to give them a better opportunity to experience a sense of relaxation. And then, you know, in the fight itself, it's, you know, I'm hearing about you trying to manage mental state. You talk about a smile, so that goes some degree to that, but also from the perspective of if it's going wrong, you know, you will have to engage as a coach in a manner that is going to have to get their mind back on the simplest possible solution, which is probably what you've prepared for. And so explicit instruction in that moment is probably going to be needed. It's not a case of solution finding. It's a case of this is what we need to do right now.
For sure.
You're capturing their attention.
Yes.
Do this now.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, in that, so you have 60 seconds in between rounds. You don't have time to be problem solving together. The athlete will want and will appreciate the information right in front of them, because they may not be in a mental state to access that information themselves. So you have to provide that level of support to them, and they will thank you for that. You know, it's not a time to have deep reflection, and you know, there's certainly a period within that 60 seconds. And this is where good coaching is really beneficial, to have a quick reflection on what's working and what's not working. But then you need to get into, okay, what's next? And then you might provide some solutions. I might actually say, you're missing the front foot bounce. You know, it's right in front of you. Let's call it out together. Let's actually count it out together. You know, and you've got them back into a mental state where they're now focused, and they're not worried about the fact that they've probably lost the first round. The first thing an athlete will do when they come back from the first round is try look at the scoreboard to see where they're up or down. That's a huge psychological thing. If they're down in the first round, they can go into a rabbit hole. If they're up on the first round, from a coaching perspective, that's not a great thing, because they can sit back a little bit. So I always try and play I probably shouldn't be saying this now, I'm showing my hand. I always try and say it's pretty even, you know. It's pretty even going into the second round. You're not up and you're not down. And just to keep them keep them that focus. Sometimes it's very obvious that they're very well up, and sometimes it's obvious that they're very well down, and you need to work with that information at that time.
It's interesting what you've just said there at the end, because I just think that what you've explained at the end in terms of what's happening around them in that moment, how well their opponent is competing, what the score is, how well they feel they're competing, how they're feeling, what the referee or the judge or whatever is doing. I think there is across elite sport, adult elite professional sport, there's a general underappreciation for the importance of mental frameworks, embedded mental frameworks, to be able to deal with the brain's propensity to judge what's going on in that moment. Because, I always talk about three mental skills: attention, intensity, intent. Attention, intensity, intent. That it's so easy for me, in my opinion, and from the reading I've done and the work at the coalface, you as a human being will judge what's happening. This is important to you. It will judge. And you've got to be able to, in many respects, to speak to what you're saying, suspend that judgment and fight, or suspend that judgment and continue to play. Even suspend the judgment and continue to swing the golf club, because the brain really works that quickly. It's working in milliseconds. It's judging what's going on. Yes. And so the importance of that embodied, embedded mental framework, whereby you have the capacity to retain attention rather than be distracted and disconnected from your environment, to retain the right intensity rather than dropping too low or rising too high, anxiety, anger, frustration, and to stay with a positive intent, executing actions positive and proactively, front foot, energy forward, rather than, because of what's happening, dipping into inhibition, uncertainty and hesitancy. Those are three massive killers for me, and they just happen in milliseconds. And I think a lot of people really underestimate that, and that's why I'm so passionate about competitive mental frameworks.
Yes, it's a great point, and I think you tend to see that a lot more with elite athletes. So those that have many years of experience at the top end of a sport. Sometimes when you're engaged with athletes who are just on their journey, they haven't put in the time, the flight time that some of the more elite level athletes have had. You can struggle with that, with keeping them in that positive moment and allowing them to overcome those negative emotions. That can be a real challenge as a coach. And I've had experience myself where I've just had to just give in to the moment and say, look, we just need to see this through now and get them out the other side of it. And sometimes that requires throwing the towel in.
Yep.
Their head is just gone, and
yep.
no amount of intervention within 60 seconds is going to pull them out of it. And that's the real struggle. That's the real challenge in coaching at that level. And to be honest with you, Dan, that can happen at elite level too. You could have the best fighter in the world get some bad news, or, the old cliche of a relationship, or something's just not right. And you can't pull them out of that hole.
Yeah.
And you just have to see it through with them.
Yeah.
Stay with them, see it through with them, be there for them, get them out the other side of it, give them some time to themselves, and then have a debrief over a coffee or something later on that evening or the following day.
Fascinating stuff. Jon, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been
a pleasure.
It's been brilliant. Really, really fascinating.
I hope I haven't rambled too
Not
much.
At all.
I'm guilty.
Not at all. It's loved every second of talking with you about this stuff, and combat sports, especially. All sports, obviously, I'm passionate about, but combat sports I just feel are so interesting, because just even to speak to the last thing that we spoke about there, it's just, I often say to the footballers, the soccer players I work with, at the extreme ends of focus, I want them to focus like a boxer, if you like, or it could be one of your taekwondo competitors, because your focus has to be so honed in on your competitive arena, your opponent, etc. Whereas in obviously a sport like football, it's easy for your focus to waver. So I'm saying, can you focus like a boxer here? Can you focus like a boxer? Can you stay tuned in?
Yeah. Single vision. Yeah.
Indeed. Really interesting stuff, and I know you would have tapped the interest of everybody listening in. And you, I know, are somebody I really enjoy following on social media. You have a very active X timeline, which is fantastic, and there's so much stuff I learn from your timeline. So you get me thinking every day there. So how can people find you and follow you? And I assume they can, if they want to get in touch, they can get in touch via social media.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for that. I think most of the stuff I post is doesn't make much sense. But look, yeah, I'm on X. I think my handle is at Jon Mackey 14. I think, and I'm usually found dabbling around the skill acquisition debates and trying to put forward a more curious maybe approach to that complex area. I'm on Instagram. Don't post as much there. I used to post quite a lot on Instagram about coaching and combat sports, and the way combat sport has gone off on a bit of a tangent, using really kind of bizarre training methods such as throwing tennis balls at people's heads to get them to move, and ladder drills and stuff like that. So that's where I used to hang out, but I'm hanging out now with, I think, better company on X, on Twitter now. So I'm there. I'm happy to engage, answer messages if anyone wants to get in touch if they feel so inclined.
That sounds like a whole nother podcast episode, throwing tennis balls
Oh,
at
don't
people's
start.
heads.
Don't start. There's an area of combat sport that has left the planet, Dan. But anyway, yes, another day's discussion, perhaps.
Jon, thank you so much.
You're welcome, Dan. Thank you.
Well, everybody, I really enjoyed that podcast, and I'd love to hear what you, the listener, think. So please do get in touch via X or Facebook or through my website, danabrahams.com, to tell me what you think of the Sports Psych Show. And if you do have any suggestions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I'm already looking forward to next week's episode. Bye for now.